The street used to have a name. People who lived there knew it well. They knew which bakery opened earliest in the morning. They knew which corner got the best afternoon light. They knew the sound of the neighborhood kids shouting, a radio playing somewhere upstairs, the smell of bread and diesel and life all mixed together. By 2013, that street didn't exist anymore. What was left looked like something out of a bad dream. Buildings cut in half, their insides exposed like a dollhouse left out in the rain. Stairways that led to nowhere. Walls with family photographs still hanging on them, even though the families were long gone. A child's bicycle, half buried under rubble. One wheel still spinning slowly in the wind like it was waiting for someone to come back and ride it. Nobody was coming back. This was Homs, a city in Syria that, not long before, had been full of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Weddings, arguments, homework, lunch breaks, evening walks. The kind of life that feels so normal you forget to appreciate it. Until one day, it's simply gone. The war had taken almost everything. A small group of soldiers moved through the Rubel that morning. They weren't running. There was no gunfire at that moment. No immediate danger pushing them forward. They walked carefully, slowly, the way you walk when you've learned that the ground beneath you can't always be trusted. Their boots stepped over broken glass, over bricks, over things that used to belong to someone. One of the soldiers was young, not a boy, but not far from it either. He had the kind of face that still looked a little surprised by everything, like part of him still couldn't fully believe where he was, what the world had become, what he had been asked to do inside it. He didn't talk much as they walked. None of them did. There's a kind of silence that exists in places like that. Not peaceful silence, not the silence of a quiet morning. It's heavier than that. It sits on your chest. It makes every small sound seem too loud. The crunch of gravel under a boot, the distant creak of a damaged wall shifting in the wind. A bird, somewhere, that hadn't gotten the message that this place was no longer for living things. They kept moving. It was the young soldier who saw it first. He stopped walking, just stopped, mid-step, like something had reached out and grabbed him gently by the shoulder. The others noticed and slowed down too, looking around for whatever had caught his attention. A threat. A shadow, something moving, but there was nothing dangerous. There was just a piano. It sat in the middle of what had once been a room. The front wall of the building was completely gone, so the room was open to the street, open to the sky, open to everything. You could see right into it: the cracked floor, the fallen ceiling plaster, the shattered window frame still clinging to one edge of the wall, and in the center of all that ruin, standing like it had absolutely no intention of going anywhere, was an upright piano. Dark wood, badly scorched along the left side, like fire had come close but hadn't quite finished the job. The lid that covered the keys was closed. A thick layer of dust sat over everything. The top, the sides, the little metal hinges. Part of the ceiling had fallen and left a chunk of plaster on top of it, but the piano itself was still standing, still whole. Nobody said anything. The young soldier stared at it for a long moment. You could see something moving across his face. Not quite recognition, not quite sadness. Something harder to name than either of those things. Something that happens when a person sees an object so deeply connected to normal life, sitting in a place where normal life has been completely erased. He walked toward it. His boots were loud on the broken floor as he crossed what was left of the room. He passed a toppled bookshelf, its books scattered and warped from water damage. He passed a small table that had somehow survived, still standing in the corner with a cracked ceramic cup sitting on top of it, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and would be back soon to finish their tea. They weren't coming back. He reached the piano and stood in front of it for a second. Then he looked around, spotted a three-legged stool nearby. The fourth leg was gone, but it was wedged against a piece of rubble in a way that kept it upright, and he dragged it over. Sat down. The other soldiers had followed slowly. They stood a few feet behind him, watching. Nobody told him to stop. Nobody said they were in a hurry. Nobody said anything at all. There was something about the moment that made words feel wrong, like speaking would break whatever was happening. He reached out and lifted the floorboard, the small cover over the keys. It moved stiffly, the hinges protesting with a soft groan, like the piano was waking up after a long sleep. Underneath, The keys were yellowed. Some were chipped. One of the lower ones was missing its ivory covering entirely, showing the bare wood underneath. It was not a beautiful instrument anymore, not the way it might have been once, but it was there, and that, somehow, felt like enough. He raised his right hand. He pressed a single key. The note that came out was not perfect. The piano was out of tune badly, in semi-places. The sound had that slightly wrong quality, a little flat, a little broken, the way old instruments get when they haven't been touched in a long time and have lived through things they weren't meant to live through. But it was a sound, in a place that had been filled with the sounds of destruction for so long, the crashes, the rumbles, the silences that were somehow worse than the crashes. This was something different, something that didn't belong to the war at all. He began to play. It wasn't a song anyone would recognize as a war song. There was no power in it, no march, no call to anything. It was quiet, gentle, the kind of melody that sneaks up on you, that starts simple and then, before you realize it, has made its way somewhere deep inside you and taken a seat without asking permission. His fingers moved slowly at first, finding the notes the way you find your footing in the dark, carefully, one at a time, trusting that the next step would hold. Then, a little more steadily, the music rose into the open air of that broken room, drifted out through the missing wall, floated into the ruined street. Nobody moved. The soldiers behind him stood completely still. One of them had his arms crossed over his chest, looking down at the floor. Another had his eyes closed. Nobody spoke. Nobody checked a watch. Nobody shifted or coughed, or did any of the small things people do when they're uncomfortable. They just listened. And outside, past the missing wall, past the rubble and the empty windows and the collapsed rooftops, the city was quiet too, as if it had been ohms. All its broken stones and shattered streets had paused for a moment. One of the soldiers slowly reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He raised it without thinking too much about it, the way you do when something is happening in front of you and you feel, without being able to explain why, that it should not disappear without anyone remembering it. He pressed record. The music continued. And for the first time in a long time, in a place where almost everything had been taken, something was being given back, quietly, imperfectly, and without asking anything in return. Just music. In the middle of the ruins, while nobody spoke. The phone camera was shaking a little. Not because the soldier holding it was afraid, just because hands do that sometimes, when something is happening in front of you that you weren't prepared for. When your body understands the weight of a moment before your mind has fully caught up with it. He held it as steady as he could and kept recording. The young soldier at the piano didn't notice. Or maybe he did notice, and it didn't matter, because he wasn't playing for the camera. He wasn't playing for the other soldiers standing behind him. He wasn't playing for anyone watching, or anyone who might ever watch later. He was playing the way people do when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time and they finally found a place to set it down, not permanently, just for a moment, just long enough to breathe. The melody moved through the open room slowly. It had no rush in it, no urgency. It rose and fell, the way breathing rises and falls. Natural, unforced, almost like the music itself was alive and tired. The same way everything in that city was tired. The piano was still out of tune in places. A few notes came out a little wrong, a little bent, but somehow that made it feel more honest, not less. A perfect sound would have felt out of place there. The imperfection fit. One of the soldiers standing behind him slowly lowered himself and sat down on a piece of broken wall. Not because he was tired, because sitting felt right, because standing felt too formal for what was happening. Another one just stared at the ground. Not in sadness, exactly. More like the way you stare at the ground when something is happening that you don't have words for, and you're not sure where else to look. And looking down feels like the most honest thing you can do. Nobody spoke. Nobody had spoken since the music started, and the silence around the music wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything that city had been through. Full of everything those men had been through. Full of all the things that don't get said during wartime because there's no space for them. No moment. No permission. The music made a space. He played for several minutes. It's hard to say exactly how long. Time moves differently in moments like that. It doesn't tick the way it normally does. It stretches and softens. The soldiers behind him weren't counting. The one with the phone wasn't watching the timer in the corner of the screen. They were just there, inside it, letting it last as long as it lasted. When the final note came, it came quietly. He didn't end with something dramatic. No big finish, no building crescendo, no moment designed to land hard. He just let the last note ring out, and then he let it fade, and then he sat there with his hands resting on the keys, not moving, as the last trace of the sound disappeared into the air. Silence came back, but it was a different silence now, softer than the one before, like the music had gone through the room and changed something on its way out, rearranged something slightly. The way a breeze moves through a space and leaves it feeling different, even though nothing you can point to has actually changed. He sat for a moment longer. Then he gently lowered the fallboard back over the keys. Slowly, like he was tucking something in, like he was being careful with it. He stood up, picked up his rifle, and without saying a word, walked back toward the others. Nobody said anything. They didn't need to. The soldier who had recorded it on his phone looked down at the screen. 1.5 minutes. That's what the footage was. 1.5 minutes of a man playing a broken piano in a broken room in a broken city. No script, no setup, no explanation. Just what it was. He wasn't sure why he kept it. He wasn't sure anyone else would understand it, or care about it, or feel what he had felt standing there. It was such a small thing, in the middle of such an enormous disaster. A few minutes of music in a war that had already swallowed years and taken so much that people had stopped counting. But he kept it anyway. And eventually, the way things do, quietly and without announcement. The video found its way onto the internet. It didn't go viral, the way loud things go viral. It didn't spread because it was shocking or dramatic or impossible to believe. It spread the way a quiet thing spreads slowly, person by person, each one passing it to someone else, not with excitement but with something more careful. Something like, asterisk. Watch this. Just watch this. Asterisk. People watched it in their homes, on their phones, on their laptops, late at night. A man sitting at a desk in a city far from Syria watched it during his lunch break and sat there for a long time afterward. Not eating, just staring at the screen. A woman watched it on her phone in a waiting room and had to put the phone face down in her lap because she didn't want anyone to see her face. A teenager watched it, shared it without writing anything in the caption, because there wasn't a caption that fit. The comments came in from everywhere, different languages, different countries, different kinds of lives, but they kept saying the same thing, over and over in different ways. Asterisk, I don't know this man. I've never been to Syria. I don't know what he's been through, but I feel something watching this that I don't have a word for. Asterisk. That's what the video did. It crossed every line that usually keeps people separate. Language, distance, politics, experience, and it found something underneath all of that. Something that everyone shares, without knowing they share it. The need for softness in the middle of hardness. The need for beauty in places where beauty has no business surviving. The need to be reminded, every once in a while, that inside every person walking through a hard life, there is still something that responds to a melody. Nobody ever found out much about the soldier who played. His name didn't go around the world with a video. His story didn't get a long article or a documentary. He wasn't pulled out of the war and placed in front of cameras to talk about what he felt. He went back to whatever came next, the same way soldiers do, one foot in front of the other, carrying what they carry, moving through what they have to move through. But the piano stayed, or at least, it stayed in the video. Frozen in that moment, dusty, scorched, slightly out of tune. Standing in the open remains of a room that no longer had walls, and the family that had once owned it, the family that had sat around it on ordinary evenings, that had maybe had a child learning to play it, that had heard it fill their home with sound. That family was somewhere else by then, displaced, scattered, living in a place that wasn't theirs, the way millions of people from that war were living. They had left the piano behind because they couldn't carry it, but also, maybe, because leaving it felt like leaving a door open, like saying, asterisk, we will come back. We have not forgotten. This is still our stud asterisk. They didn't come back, but the piano was played one last time, by a stranger who had never met them, who didn't know their names, who had no idea whose home he was standing in. And that stranger gave the piano and everything it had witnessed one last moment of being what it was always meant to be. Not a piece of furniture left behind in a war, but an instrument making music, for no reason except that music was the only thing left that made sense. And when the last note faded and the soldier stood up and the silence came back, it was not the same silence as before. It was quieter. It was gentler. It was the kind of silence that comes after something true has been said, even when no words were used at all. Nobody spoke, because nobody needed to.